Hello everyone, I'm Qian Yuhan, and together with my teammates Liu Jiaxin and Chen Zhen, we will present our analysis of inflation and stabilization policy in Singapore. This is part of our intermediate macroeconomic project. The presentation today is divided into 4 parts. Okay, now let's start our presentation. The first part is introduction and conceptual framework. Today I want to talk about a big challenge Singapore has faced over the past 10 years: rising prices, or what we usually call inflation. Inflation has gone through different phases. In the earlier part of the decade, it was slow and stable, but since changes in recent years, and the prices started climbing more quickly. As a small and open economy, Singapore is affected by both global and local factors. We've seen higher costs from things like energy prices and supply chain issues, and also local pressures like rent, COE, and wages. To deal with this, the government used a mix of course, adjusting the exchange rate to manage import costs and giving targeted support to households. So what exactly is inflation? It's when prices go up over time and our money buys less than before. In Singapore, we measure it using the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which tracks how much everyday goods and services cost. Understanding inflation helps us see why it matters and what can be done to keep it under control. Now let's give the floor to Liu Jiaxin, who will talk about next part of our presentation.
Thank you, Han. Inflation basically means price go up and our money doesn't go as far as before. In Singapore, we check this using the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Over the past decade, inflation has been quite a roller coaster. At one point, core inflation reached 5.5% and CPI even spiked to 7.5%. This was driven by two main factors. Globally, things like oil price and shipping costs went up. Locally, we faced rising COE prices, housing rents, and wage. Even though inflation has eased a bit, it's still around 3%, which is higher than our Euro 1.5 to 2%. So what did Singapore do about it? We deal with it from two sides: monetary policy and fiscal policy. The MAS slowed down the pace of the Singapore dollar's rise. That helped take pressure off exports and the property market, but the downside is exchange rate tools aren't as precise as cutting interest rates, and global issues like US tariff can still weaken the impact. Second, fiscal policy. The government gave directly support cash payouts between $600 to $800 and rent help for hawkers. On trade, we avoided tariff fights and focused on regional partnerships to keep supply chains steady. These moves gave real and immediate help to people and business, but in an open economy like ours, too much physical spending has its limits. Then let's welcome Chen Zhen to present the next section.
Thank you to Liu Jiaxin for the presentation. Now I will introduce the macroeconomic prospects and the theoretical framework. This slide shows Singapore's possible macroeconomic scenarios in the future. In the best case, energy prices stay stable, supply chains recover, and the strong Singapore dollar keeps import costs low. Inflation stays around 1 to 2%, and GDP may grow by 2.5%. In the worst case, global shocks, rising wages, or tighter monetary policies could push inflation above 4% and slow growth to about 1%. The expected case is moderate. We expect inflation to ease to around 1.5% and growth to stay close to 1.5% as well. Overall, this highlights the need to balance short-term measures with long-term planning to keep inflation low and growth steady. Singapore's short-term macroeconomic outlook can be explained using basic macroeconomic models learned in this course. First, the ADS model shows how external shocks affect Singapore's aggregate demand and aggregate supply. For example, higher global energy price or supply chain problems in the past years shifted AS leftward, causing cost push inflation and higher price for households and firms. Recent easing of supply conditions and a strong exchange rate policy help shift AS back to the right, which should help lower inflation pressure. The PPF model highlights the importance of balancing short-run policies with long-term capacity building. We need to balance short-term macro controls like exchange rates, subsidies, and transfers with long-term capacity building, including reforms, upscaling, and technology to keep inflation low and growth strong in a sustainable way. The SLM model, which links the goods market and the money market, is slightly different in Singapore because MIS does not mainly use interest rate but the exchange rate. By strengthening the Singapore dollar, MIS indirectly influences the money market and the domestic demand. A stronger dollar lowers import rates but can reduce export competitiveness, which is shown in the IS curve shifting slightly left if exports slow down. Combining these models helps explain why Singapore's expected scenario predicts inflation easing to around 1.5%, while GDP growth stays modest at 1.5%, assuming stable global conditions and effective policy management. Now, let's invite Qian Yuhan, who will talk about the next part of our presentation.
Thanks, changing the last part is conclusion, recommendations, and references. To wrap up, at different times over the past 10 years, Singapore faced high inflation, mainly because of global energy price spikes and supply chain issues. The government's response, stressing the Singapore dollar and introducing targeted fiscal support, has helped ease price pressures and protect households. But the economy is still vulnerable to imported cost shocks, and relying too much on exchange rate policy could hurt export competitiveness. Looking ahead, maintaining stability will mean carefully balancing monetary and fiscal tools, while pushing for structural reports to build long-term resilience. So based on our analysis, here are a few recommendations to manage inflation more effectively. First, keep the Singapore dollar strong to help lower imported inflation, but avoid letting it rising too much, as that could hurt exports. Second, invested in productivity and green technology through RIE 2025 and to bolster supply capacity and support sustainable growth. Third, strengthening automatic stabilizers like subsidies for lower income households to make the system fairer and more resilient. Fourth, adopt a gradual approach to monetary tightening instead of certain changes, so we can balance inflation control with stability, growth, and finally, communicate clearly with businesses and households to keep inflation expectations stable and build confidence in the economy. Here are the key academic and institutional sources that support our analysis. Thank you for your attention. We are happy to talk any questions you may have. That's the end for our group here. Thank you.